Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and we're here with Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity. And today we are joined by Jeff Crosby. Jeff is a longtime friend of Writing for Your Life, and he's a return interviewee. And today we're talking with Jeff about his newest book, World of Wonders. And the subtitle is A Spirituality of Reading. And so this is a beautiful gentle and meditative book on the spirituality of reading and really interesting. It's interesting to read about reading. So I'm really excited to, Jeff, talk to you today. Just briefly, Jeff is the president of ECPA, which is a major trade association of Christian publishing. Jeff has worked in bookselling and publishing for more than 4 decades, and your experience and insights about books in general and reading writ large really come through in this book. So, I know you just bring a huge breadth and depth of knowledge and experience with books and with the publishing industry. So I'm so glad and grateful you published this book, Jeff, and I really look forward to talking to you about it. Maybe you can just start off by telling us a little bit about the book and what you were hoping to accomplish and kind of what motivated you to write this book in the first place. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, Kate, thank you for having me back. It's always a joy to be engaged with the Writing for Your Life community. So thanks for your interest in the project and for this conversation. I think if you work in the world of books, all of your adult life, as I have, you're constantly thinking about, questions like, why have I done this? And has it mattered? And how can I encourage other people who, regardless of where they are on the spectrum of being a super reader to an occasional reader, how can I encourage them in their journey of crafting a reading life? But as I made my way from a publisher that I had worked for 24 plus years into this role, some space opened up for me to return to my own writing that I had sort of set aside. When you work in publishing directly, you often cannot care for your own writing life. And that's sort of what happened to me. But as I made the shift about 4.5 years ago, space opened up, and I had three specific books to work on, and this is the second of the three. And I think, yeah, I was motivated by a desire to meet people wherever they were on the reading continuum, and then to help them journey forward, not only to perhaps being a deeper reader or a more regular reader, but to read through all the seasons of their life, to read as they to continue to read as they age, as they face challenges, whether mental or physical challenges that even I, at my age of beginning, are beginning to encounter, and just to keep at it, whether it's audiobooks or ebooks or print books. So that animated the decision. And then in terms of how did I approach it, it's kind of three sections. The first section is, why is that important? So kind of a apologetic, if you will, for the very act of reading, generally reading scripture, and then reading as what I call a spiritual discipline. The middle section is an apologetic for reading certain genres, fiction, poetry, memoir, and then diverse voices, reading books that we might actually disagree with, or reading books by voices that are new to us or are different from who we are. And then the third, which is arguably my favorite of the three sections, is reading in the seasons of life. It loops back to what I was saying. How can we read in the midst of grief, seasons of grief, or seasons of doubt, or seasons of wonder, seasons of the family life, and seasons of the church year. I had other seasons, but I had a word count, so I had to choose my favorite 5 seasons in which books accompanied me. They were as if my companions or my friends or my spiritual directors in those seasons. So yeah, that's the way I approach it. That's what we packaged together in a little less than 200 pages, I suppose, and very hopeful that it will encourage folks in their journey.
Well, thank you for that. And maybe you can just talk, broadly about how you conceive of reading or how one can conceive of reading as a spiritual discipline or a spiritual practice. And at one point, um, that you were quoting Nancy Malone, is sort of the linkages between reading and meditation. So I think that's one angle of it, but you explore, multiple angles of it. So how can one think of reading as a spiritual discipline or practice?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, especially if they grew up in the church, which I did not, they may think of reading the Bible as a spiritual practice. You have devotionals that are introducing you to scripture in little bite-sized chunks. But yeah, I do liken the reading of books, the reading of things beyond, to as a spiritual discipline. Richard Foster, in his classic, in I believe 1978, Celebration of Discipline, he has a chapter on study. He doesn't call it books, but I think if I were to talk to him today, he would say, "Yeah, yeah." If I was revising that, I probably would say books rather than just study. Nancy Malone, who you referred to, I believe her book is called Walking a Literary Labyrinth, and she likens reading to a labyrinth, to walking through, whether it with our finger, as some people do, or literally our physical bodies walking a labyrinth. I think reading helps still us. It helps I mean, I believe solitude and silence are disciplines that open up space for everything else, for all other disciplines. And I think, at least in my experience, especially if I'm reading alone rather than in a group like a book group, it creates a stillness of mind, a stillness of heart that where the author, particularly actually if it's poetry, which I know a lot of people say, oh, I can't read poetry. I don't read poetry. But particularly for me, there's just a level of paying attention that poetry calls us to. And I think you yourself have written poetry. It calls us to that just opens up so much else. So yeah, those are the ways in which I sort of try to approach the reading as a spiritual discipline. Yes, we need to read the Bible, absolutely, and devotional materials. And one of my companions through the pandemic was a devotional psalter that married each of the 150 Psalms with a meditative reflection. But I think we can also think of reading a book of poetry or a Kenta Rough novel or a memoir as a spiritual practice as well. So I'm just kind of encouraging and challenging readers to think more broadly about the spiritual practice of reading and to do more of that.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to make a guilty confession, which is so I'm a big fan of the practice Lectio Divina, which is,
Yeah.
meditating, typically on scripture and really going sort of deeper and deeper as a meditative practice. But I practice Lectio Divina with texts that aren't just Holy Scripture, and I've always sort of, it was that breaking the rules. So I felt encouraged by your book.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. And at one point, you used the language of developing a liturgy of reading. And as someone who comes from a denomination within the Christian tradition that is very liturgical, I was intrigued by that phrase. And so maybe you can just talk about what you mean by a liturgy of reading, and if you have practical advice for someone who's really wanting to develop a spiritual practice around reading.
Yeah. I begin and I end every day with reading. It doesn't mean that I don't read at other times of the day. I do as I can, but I make space in the morning and in the evening for reading. Now, fortunately, you had a confession on Lectio Divina. I'll have one too, that I'm married to someone who reads even more voraciously than I. And that helps if you are in a relationship with someone or a spouse or what have you, a housemate that doesn't enjoy reading, you could have a little bit more of a difficult time creating that liturgy. But that's sort of a practice that both of us entered into early in our marriage, and we've just sustained it now for 40 some odd years. So that helps. But I think also a place, having a place that, sort of signals to your brain, this is the time, this is the place, and this is what we're doing. And that could be in a Panera Bread. For a period of time, I actually wrote in one of those restaurants before the pandemic, and but also would make time for reading when I'm out, when I'm traveling, things like that. So making a time, you don't have to schedule it and put it on your calendar, but just know you're going to do that morning, noon, evening, whenever works for you, and having a place where you do it. I never travel without more than a single book. I know I could buy one on the road, but I tuck books into the bag that have access to wherever I go. One of those books I actually write about, I believe in the introduction, is Dag Hammarskjöld's spiritual classic called Markings. And I was interviewed earlier today by someone else, and I showed the picture of my paperback copy, my Ballantine books, and it's literally held together by a rubber band. That is a book that goes with me everywhere, but there's always at least one other. So um, yeah, some of those practices, I'm sure there are others I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but the most important is making space. And for me, it's morning and night.
So maybe you can say a little bit about your morning reading practice,
Yeah.
because I associate reading for pleasure with nighttime and sort of relaxing in bed. And so, is it fair to assume that your morning reading is more devotional in nature, or is it ever recreational? Do you ever start your day with kind of a pleasure book?
Absolutely. In fact, this morning I started my day, I'm almost done with, and I wanted to get to the finish line on Richard Osman's book, The Thursday Murder Club. So that
Oh,
is
I love that series.
it is definitely a pleasure reading, not a deep spiritual, although Father Mackey, and there are a few things in there, but of course, sometimes I begin the day. I would say that's less likely. Yeah, that the morning is typically some sort of spiritual reflection kind of reading. But if I'm in the middle of a really good novel for pleasure, you can be assured that I will give myself the grace to use that morning time and finish it off. So, and also a book about a current women's basketball sensation, Caitlin Clark. I'm just fascinated by who this person is and what has happened around her. And so Christine Brennan, a USA Today sports person that I've appreciated. She's another recent morning read that I had just for fun.
Well, it feels so like uh, delicious but it also indulgent, like a little naughty or something to read for pleasure in the morning. So, but I think that that really speaks to what you're saying, which is that this, that there's something so life-giving and life-affirming about reading. And so, and I know you're a very busy person with a, huge career on your plate. And so I think that that's actually really inspiring that you prioritize reading to such a degree that you make
Yeah.
time for that, whether it's for pleasure or devotional and or both. So thank you. Well, there was a little section that caught my eye, and it was kind of a paradox, paradox to what we're talking about, or maybe a sort of a twist, which I think it's one of a colleague or a friend of yours, Rick Lewis, a bookseller you say in Dallas, and you talked about how he explored the spiritual discipline of fasting and applied it to reading. And so
Yeah.
perhaps you could tell a little bit about that. But what really caught my eye was that he gave himself permission to not finish a book. And I
Mm.
am a big believer of not finishing books. And sometimes, especially when I'm reading spiritual texts, I will pick book up in the middle, depending on sort of what captures my. So I'm really a big believer in this, but I know a lot of people who are very anxious about starting a book because they feel compelled to finish it. And so
Yeah.
maybe you can just talk a little bit about that, those dimensions that you sort of discuss in that section.
Oh my goodness. I have been for years was one of those people you just described who, if he or she started the book, felt obligated to finish. Um, and really, in the last 2 to 3 years, I've overcome that addiction to needing to finish everything I started. I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was someone I was interviewing for my work at ECPA. And I confessed in the interview that this is a dilemma that I have, that I feel like I have to. And he was an Anglican priest, and he reached out his arms and he said, Jeff, I give you the grace to stop, it's feeling that way. You can begin things and end them if they're not captivating you. So in recent years, I have overcome that. But what Rick Lewis, who runs Lagos Bookstore in Dallas, Texas, near the Southern Methodist University campus, he was seeing his spiritual director, and she is the one who said, "Have you ever thought about fasting from reading books?" He was confessing that he had a hard time prioritizing the reading of the Bible. That he read all the time, but he had a hard time prioritizing reading the Bible. And that's when she said, You fast, as a spiritual discipline. Have you thought about fasting from reading books?" And to him, that was just anathema. But there was something about the way she asked him and the grace with which she asked him that he thought, A, no, I've never thought about that. And B, maybe I need to give it a try. And as he did that, it wasn't a long period of time where he set aside reading of books, but a short amount of time, he re-engaged with scripture and the wonder of that, the beauty, the paradoxes of it, the hard things about it. He re-encountered as if for the first time. So I included it because that has been some of my experience as well, that it's much easier for me to prioritize reading books of various kinds than it has been to do sustained reading of the Bible. And yet I do believe that's important. There's a whole chapter about reading scripture as a spiritual discipline. So yes, good old Rick allowed me to use that rather vulnerable story in the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And again, I think that that shows just a different dimensionality of this bigger concept of reading as a spiritual practice. So,
Yeah.
really interesting thought. Well, as you mentioned in the beginning, you have this section where you talk about sort of different genres, fiction and
Yeah.
memoir and poetry. And you mentioned poetry already. And as we were just talking about before, I am working on a collection of poetry with my husband. And so the section on poetry really captured my attention. And so maybe I really just loved how, you talked about when you used to own a bookstore that you had a whole section devoted to poetry kind of on principle. And so I think that that just,
Yeah.
speaks volumes, no pun intended, about your commitment and interest in poetry. And you also talk at the end about paying attention and how poetry can help us pay attention. So can you just talk a little bit about, if you want to, the other genres, but, again, I was specifically intrigued about your sort of the ways you talked about poetry as part of this.
Yeah. Yeah, in the bookstore where we had several linear feet of books by Lucy Shaw and Madeline L'Engle and Scott Cairns and many, many others who are Christians and writing poetry. I will confess it was the least shopped section in the entire store, sadly. It's one of the reasons why a lot of bookstores don't stock, or if they do stock poetry, it's in like gift books or things like that. It's sadly, at least in those days. Now that was the 1980s and early to mid 1990s. It wasn't well trafficked. But as I've gotten older, the reading of poetry has been a part of certainly every month, if not every week. The poet Mary Oliver is someone that I would say she probably instilled this as much as just about anyone, Wendell Berry as well. And so I felt, even though I knew that most interviewers, apart from you, have said, I don't really get the reading of poetry. Can you help me understand? Um, I felt that I needed to include it, and there's a little interview at the end of each chapter, but the one in the poetry chapter is with Lucy Shaw, about actually the writing of poetry, but by implication, the reading. I also included with permission, a lengthy poem by Ted Kooser, who is a poet laureate from Nebraska. And the poem I included is called Estate Sale. So let me talk just briefly about estate sale, and because it illustrates what poetry does for me. Kuzer in that poem is literally walking around an estate sale in a barn, a house, a farm in Nebraska, or it could be Iowa where he was born. It's hard to say. And he's describing the things that are being auctioned off. And I mean, things like a window pane or a piano or a coffee can of screws and nails. And you might think, so what? But to me, when I read that poem, I was there. I was on that farm in Nebraska and I was walking with him. I was looking at everything he was looking at. I could see it, I could smell it, I could feel it, and it transported me back to the home of my great grandparents in a little town called Sealyville, Indiana, um, and and the structures that were on that property, and so it took me back to the early 1960s when I was a young child. And it stopped me it arrested my attention and made me observe. It made me observe. And that's, I think, what poetry does. If we read it well, it helps us observe both the words on the page, the images and the smells and sights and feels of what the poet is describing, and then also what's happening in our souls as we read, where it's taking us. And so, yeah, I felt like we could have done other genres that might have been more popular, but I felt like I had to include that. And it was actually one of the chapters I felt best about. And my great hope is that at the end, there's a list of 12 or 15 works of poetry. My great hope is that a reader is going to pick up one or two or three of those and um, and say, "Oh, okay, I do understand." So yeah, reading
Beautiful. Thank you
reading
for that
poetry
encouragement.
is a key thing that I practice, and I hope others will as a result.
Well, thank you. And so, as we were briefly talking about before we started recording, so of course this, the audience for this conversation is largely the Writing for Your Life community, and that's
Yeah.
a group of aspiring, emerging, and existing authors of multiple genres, but people who identify as spiritual writers. And what I really have learned with engaging in this community over the past several years, more and more, is that that writers are readers and
Mhm.
readers are sometimes writers, but I went to a conference and so many there's just such a deep connection between writing and reading. And so um and I know that it's really important also for writers to be reading widely and
Yeah.
both to just be honing their craft and be getting inspiration and to be supporting other writers, etc. But just from your vantage point as an author of multiple books, and in the publishing industry, you've had such a broad look at the industry, and I'm curious whether publishing this book, World of Wonders, whether there were any surprises, any lessons learned, any aha moments or advice you have for spiritual writers, kind of based on your experience with this most recent book.
Yeah. I think one of the ahas was by giving some of the space of the book to other writers. As I said, every chapter has a vignette. It's often about 200 words. In one case, it was more like 500. But I invited much more well-published authors than me to contribute a vignette at the end. And I was struck by both the commonalities of what they said. So on the chapter of reading memoir, someone wrote about their experience with memoir. There was commonality across the chapters, but there was also just some really unique stories or unique viewpoints that each of those writers brought to their vignette. And I wasn't sure when you give over space to other people, I wasn't sure what might happen, but I was just sort of charmed by the voices. J. Brent Bill, who may have spoken to Writing for Your Life in the past, I'm not sure. Lucy Shaw, Ed Gilbreth, who I know has spoken to Publishing in Color, and others. So, in terms of advice, definitely reading and reading widely, and also reading really good writing. Sort of not just books about how to write well, but books that are written well, and really that have elevated the craft of writing. Um, and I think also writing in community. The most recent project that's not been published yet, I more than the first two, I opened myself up to, sharing some of the chapters. It's a book on music, and I'm perhaps less, well, no, I am very much less known for writing about music than writing about things in World of Wonders. And so there was a bit of vulnerability in doing so. And so I brought in my community a little more deeply than I had on the first two works that have now been published. So I would say expose yourself to the feedback and of others, and try, if it's even just one person, try to find someone with whom you can share your writing, and be that sort of proverbial iron sharpening iron, which I didn't really do to the same extent on these first two books.
Well, thank you so much. And maybe just turning your ourselves back to your book, I want
Mhm.
to ask you about the part three, which is, focus on reading during the different seasons of life, and the sections on grief and loss, and also doubt and fear, really,
Yeah.
jumped out at me, particularly because, again, sort of what can reading do for us during the most painful times in our lives, especially if we feel overwhelmed and not sure sort of how to cope. What place does reading have in those moments of darkness or perhaps overwhelm?
Yeah. I think that just born out of my own experience, in those two chapters were the hardest perhaps ones to write. So they felt quite vulnerable. That is to say, doubt and fear, and the other is grief and loss. But I just think reading, yes, it can be hard, especially reading voluminous books. I would say try to find things that are shorter. There was a book, I'll not recall the author's name, but a book called Wintering, that in the midst of the pandemic was very, very much a companion. And it was an average size book. It certainly wasn't brief. Just so looking for things that you can tackle in the midst of those seasons, giving yourself grace to take plenty of time and reading them. Um, and I found personally in those seasons of my own life that books were friends on that part of my journey. They were companions, they were guides. It helped me to know that I wasn't alone. Um, But yeah, I do acknowledge, as you imply, that reading in those seasons when you feel so stretched and overwhelmed, how do you find time to do that? And that can be a challenge. You might look and see if a book has been, if there's a podcast or an interview, such as, something with you, that is easier to digest than a complete book, and or listen to a portion of an audiobook, a chapter that catches your attention. And just give yourself grace in those times if you feel that you can't work through an entire book.
Yeah, and I think that's so I'm just what's coming to mind is my sister-in-law experienced a tremendous loss. She had a stillbirth and she actually went on to write a book, a memoir about the experience. And I remember during the period when we were all grieving so immensely, it was such a
Mhm.
shock and a loss. She had a book on grief and I picked it up and sort of flipped to the middle and just something, a sentence
Yeah.
changed the way I was thinking about it and grieving. And, so again, I think it goes back to that. You don't have to, feel obligated to pick up book and read from
Right.
page 1 to 200 linearly. So I think that that's a real word of encouragement.
Yeah, there's a series that your audience may know of called Every Moment Holy. It's published by the Rabbit Room Press. And reading like that, where you can literally, there are liturgies that are very beautifully organized around certain topic, including grief and loss and fear and doubt. So, reading things like that may just be short pieces of writing or brief liturgies, but where you can pinpoint the thing that may speak to you, and just do that. That's fine too.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Well, I'd like to ask you sort of a big picture question, but also, come back to what you mentioned at the beginning, which is the section about talking about or an intention to sort of encourage people to read um, writers who maybe they disagree with or they're not familiar with or kind of or have a different perspective. And so I'll combine two questions into one. Just if you could speak a little bit more about that, and maybe then big picture, what are you hoping, in your wildest dreams, sort of what impact are you hoping that this book might have? Some things come to my mind is pretty obvious, and we've already touched on a few of them, but I do think you bring in so many different voices, as you said, and so it's a beautiful exploration. So maybe those two questions are sort of sister inquiries.
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely my hope is that people within the community that I work alongside, so the publishing community, that they'll be affirmed and they'll be encouraged in their work, because the work of publishing, whether you're an author or a publisher right now, it's really challenging. And your writers who are listening know that a lot of work is pushed on the author, but that isn't to say that the publisher isn't working hard and doing as much or more than they used to. It's just the whole ecosystem is oriented toward noise and clutter, and so it makes the job of the author and the publisher harder. So my hope is that this book will encourage both sides of that equation, those of you who write and my friends who work in publishing and what they're doing. I also hope, as I alluded to earlier, that people who are like I was when I was 18 or 19 and not much of a reader. I read the Sunday newspaper comics like Snuffy Smith and Beetle Bailey, and I read biographies of baseball stars like Lou Gehrig and Henry Aaron, and not much more. My hope is that I'll catch maybe readers who find themselves in that space and encourage them to move along the spectrum to making reading more of a part of their life. So, and the second part of your question, Kate, could you repeat it? Because I've
Yeah,
lost
just
that
to
thread.
Yeah, sorry, and
That's okay.
I doubled up. But just to talk a little bit more about the practice, the intentionality around being
Yeah.
exposed to new voices.
Yeah.
Um,
I I think that we're creatures of habit. We as human persons, if we don't push against it, we're like black cat Lewin, who he just has this rhythm. Every morning he wakes me up 5:30, which also, by the way, helps me read in the morning. He wakes me up at 5:30. He does the same things every morning. And it's almost like my little cat has a liturgy, he's a creature of habit. And similarly, we as human persons are, and we gravitate toward the authors we know, the people whose stories may be similar to ours, or our favorite genre. The gentleman who interviewed me earlier today, for him, it was totally nonfiction, and he just didn't really have much time for anything else. And and so I said to him, you know what? You need to break yourself of that habit. Because I do think if you're not a regular reader of fiction, reading it helps cultivate empathy in your life. It helps you see things through the lens and the experience of another person. Similarly, poetry, it helps cultivate a slowness and attentiveness that, reading a David Baldacci novel simply doesn't do. In that case, you're just whizzing through because you want to make sure the bad guy gets caught and the good guy gets the accolades. And reading diverse voices probably is the hardest. I talk in that chapter about a season of my life when I was reading books on the what's called the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, I believe. And I took a trip to Tulsa to kind of immerse myself in that part of that city, the Greenwood part, but it all came to me through books. And had I not been committed to reading that story from authors of color, not just historians, recounting the facts, I think my understanding of what happened and why, and how we continue to pay the price, even to this day, would have been impoverished. So, but it just takes discipline. It takes intentionality. It causes us to risk and getting out of our comfort zone, which I don't love doing, but I know I need to do, and I'm committed to doing it. So my encouragement is give it a try, and I think as you do, whether it's the genre stretch or the diverse voices stretch, you'll capture the reasons why that's important, I think.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I'll share just a little anecdote from my own journey. So, as I mentioned before, I'm in the middle of attending seminary,
Yeah,
and of course, this is a heavy reading season in my life. But my advisor said something, which is, he's like, you need to be reading more than just your seminary reading. And so, with his encouragement and just, I mean, not that I wouldn't have anyway, but just again, similar to what you're saying. So if I'm at night reading, a murder mystery or a sci-fi or whatever, that's part of being a well-rounded human being and
yeah,
being a not, a thoughtful person. And so anyway, well,
absolutely.
speaking of being a thoughtful person, Jeff, I just want to thank you. You are such your thoughtfulness and your insightfulness and your invitation are just such gifts to the world. Your voice and your writing is so inviting. There's a gentleness, but also an urgency around this topic. So I appreciate you very much as a person and as a writer, and really encourage others to check out your book, World of Wonders, A Spirituality of Reading. And so, Jeff, maybe we can end by you can tell us where I assume we can find this book, wherever books are sold, and where we can learn more about your work, your writing, if there's any final things you want to share about the book before we wrap up.
Yeah, well, as a long-term former independent bookseller, I would encourage you, if you have a store in your community, even if they don't carry it, they can order it and you can get it in a few days. So I'd start there. And bookshop.org is an organization that's doing great work helping independent bookstores. So that would be my second port of call of encouragement to you if you don't have a bookstore nearby. You can find out about my writing at jeffreycrosby.net, Jeffrey, crosby.net. Be posting some information about the next book before too long. And then, of course, you can find it online at christianbook.com or Amazon. But start with your local store or bookshop.org. Proceeds from purchases at bookshop.org actually benefit independent bookstores. So, yeah.
Great. Well, and you can read this beautiful meditation on, you can read about reading, which is really, again, just a wonderful invitation and reminder and encouragement in many directions. So thank you, Jeff, for your work and for sharing these thoughts and your creativity with the world, and blessings as you continue to launch it out.
Thank you, Kate. It's always a joy to be with you. Take
All
care.
right, thanks. Keep us posted on how it goes.
Will
Thanks
do.
again.